Hello, my students. It's your favorite teacher, Mr. Jacobson. I'm excited to be with you, and we can discuss the coming end of Rome here as a republic, and also we're going to talk about the famous, some would argue, immortal Julius Caesar. Even after his death, he is still very much on people's minds and is highly praised by all. So, let us begin. So we left off with the Punic Wars. After the Punic Wars, things got a little crazy for the farmers in Rome. Um, they were deep in poverty. They were deep in debt. You know, these small time farmers. These are people who, well, they were the ones who were fighting in the war, in the Punic Wars, and while they're away fighting, then they're they're not being able to manage their farms like they should. So their farms are being underdeveloped, and they're out fighting. And then also, as we remember, Hannibal, he enters into the Italian peninsula, and he starts raising havoc all around that area, and so people's farms are being destroyed, and properties being destroyed, and so when it comes after the Punic Wars, there's just a lot of debt, especially on the farmers, because they're just unable to upkeep their farms, because when they're fighting, and two, of all the havoc that happened to the land. And when people are in debt, then problems occur because it becomes the problems of the state eventually. So another reason why the farmers were getting into debt and in deep poverty. So we have something called the Latifundia, and these are well, I'll just read it here. It was hard for these small farms to compete with the new Latifundia, large estates owned by wealthy Romans. So Latifundia was similar to the plantations here in America during the Civil War area. These were huge farms which were built into these plantations where you needed a ton of slaves to work on them as a plantation owner, and in Rome it's no different. Excuse me. So these large owners of the Latifundia, they they uh, they would employ the slaves to work on them. When I say employ, they bought slaves, and the slaves worked on them, and uh, and these slaves were prisoners from the Punic Wars. So many of these slaves would be people who fought against them in Carthage and so on. And many out of work farmers, they got angry because the influx of slaves from war um, were kind of replacing them. And so the small time farmers were being slowly replaced by these slave workers because the slave work was so much cheaper than if a farmer had a piece of land and worked on it. So things are really starting to get fired up in the Roman Republic right now. The Punic Wars, although they won, left them with many problems as well. So, one thing that the government decided to do as a result of these farmers being out of work, out of land, uh, why don't we just give them food and entertainment? So the government began the practice of supplying food and entertainment to the poor. This was known and is still known today as bread and circuses. Bread for the food, circuses meaning for the entertainment. Many politicians they began promising free stuff from the government to get their votes. So no longer are they trying to say really smart things that will be for the benefit of Rome, but they are now trying to what we call pander to the people, especially the poor. They're saying, "Look, you're poor. It's not your fault you're poor. This is the problem. This is the problem. You're just a victim. But guess what? If I'm voted in, I will make sure that you are constantly fed and you'll have entertainment." And so slowly this transition happens where people are going from working and independence to government dependence. And this is also helping dishonest rulers to come to power who really aren't necessarily interested in helping these people more than they are just gaining the power of having the consulship, etc. So here we have Juvenal, who lived a little bit later than the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, but he makes he talks about his feelings about this whole idea of he calls it bread and games. He says, "Now that no one buys our votes, the public has long since cast off its cares. The people that once bestowed commands, consulships, legions, and all else now meddles no more and longer now meddles no more and longs eagerly for just two things, bread and games." Here's one by Cicero. "The evil was not in bread and circuses per se, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games which should serve to distract them from the other human hungers that bread and circuses can never appease." And the last one, this is a little more faded, but by these practices and enticements, the ancient dictators so successfully lulled their subjects under the yoke that the stupefied peoples, fascinated by the pastimes and vain pleasures lavished before their eyes, learned subservience as naively but not so credibly as little children learn to read by looking at bright books. So we have these are people who lived in that time period, and they saw the denigration of bread and circuses and how it just slowly eroded such a powerful and proud empire to what it eventually became. So there are two brothers. They're called the Gracchus brothers, and Tiberius and Gaius, and they saw that the biggest problem was is that there are people who just they lost their land because they're in serious debt because they couldn't, one, they had to fight in the war, and two, they got in debt with their land and they couldn't upkeep it and they couldn't pay their debtors, which are usually the more wealthy people, the LATIFUNDIAs. And so the Gracchus brothers thought, look, let's go to the Senate and ask them, look, take back some of the public land that the rich from the rich, and then let's divide it among the landless Roman farmers. We'll just give it to them and say, look, you have land again, you have ownership, you have pride in something. Start working and get some self-respect back. Get some get get some ownership and some pride back in your work of contributing to Rome. And so the Gracchus brothers wanted to take that land that was taken from these small farmers and give it back to them. And they believed that that would actually improve Rome, because then the people would actually have something to work for and would have a purpose to work for, and would not be so lazy anymore. So many of the senators, the problem is that many of the senators, they own public land. So this very same land, they're saying take it and give it back to the poor farmers who lost their land. A lot of the senators, they own that public land. They were owners of latifundias, and so they didn't want to give it back. So they did not follow the brothers' plan, but instead they just followed their own selfish desires. So they didn't care what was good for Rome. This is what we should do. They they're starting to care about what's good for them and not for the betterment of Rome. And so the brothers, they continued to gain lots of support from the people, but eventually they were murdered because they were getting to be too big of a threat. And the most likely people in the Senate murdered them. Now Julius Caesar. Now Julius Caesar's a military leader. I'm sorry. Military leaders began using their power to influence the political system in Rome. Okay. So, military leaders are starting to say, hey, I have a huge army here. Maybe I can use this to persuade the Senate to go a different direction in politics. So, there are three people there's Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, and they use their power to form the first triumvirate, which is a political alliance of three people. Now, Crassus dies in war, and the Senate, fearing Caesar's popularity, chose Pompey to rule Rome. Well, as a result, Caesar marches on Rome, driving Pompey out and seizing power. Now, the Senate, because Caesar was such a more brilliant statistician and leader than Pompey, Senate was forced to have to accept him as their leader. So, Julius Caesar declares himself lifelong dictator. Now remember, a dictator is only supposed to rule for about 6 months, and then they're supposed to give it up. But now, Julius Caesar, he's called himself a lifelong dictator. What does that mean? Interesting. He replaced people in the Senate that was loyal to him. So, not every, no. Now he changed the rule that the Senate isn't the lifelong call anymore. I have the power to change that. He granted citizenship to the people in the Roman territories. He opened new colonies to give land to the landless, giving work to Rome's jobless people. Ordered landowners using slaves to hire freemen as workers. Changed the calendar to 365 days with a leap year. Sound familiar? He had a lot of really good things going on there. He gained a lot of support from the people. They actually loved him. The poor and the common people just loved this individual. However, many feared his growing power and that he would make himself one day king. Now he called himself a lifelong dictator, and they were afraid that he would make himself king. Interesting. A group of senators led by two friends, Brutus and Cassius, surrounded him and stabbed him to death. So one day, his two great friends, they start a coup in the Senate, and and they ambush him, a bunch of senators, and they just stab him to death. Now, prior to his murder, he received a warning, which is very famous in history. It's called "Beware of the Ides of March," which he was warned that something bad would happen on the 15th of March. And that's what happened on March 15th in 44 BC. That's when he was murdered. And after his death, Octavian, his grandnephew, eventually became the first emperor of Rome. And that's it. So, uh, yeah, so we went from after the Punic Wars all the way to Julius Caesar, and then at the end of Julius Caesar's life, and beginning on Octavian, who will later be called Caesar Augustus. That is where the Roman Empire officially ends and the Roman Republic begins. So, go ahead and enjoy your writing your one-page summary. If you have any questions, talk to me in class. I look forward to seeing you at the beginning of the week. Okay, bye-bye.